Imagine waking up before dawn, the air sharp with the scent of eucalyptus and red dust, the sound of kookaburras cutting through the darkness like a warning. Around you, the land stretches endlessly in every direction, ancient and alive, breathing with a presence that modern people have almost entirely forgotten how to feel. You are not simply living in Australia. You are Australia. You are part of a civilization so old, so deeply embedded in this continent, that every rock, every waterhole, every constellation overhead has a name, a story, and a sacred purpose. Today, we are going to find out what it was really like to be an Aboriginal Australian 40,000 years ago. But before we dive in, make sure you subscribe so you never miss another journey into the forgotten corners of human history. Let's start with something that tends to shock people when they first hear it. Aboriginal Australians are not just one of the oldest cultures on Earth. They represent the longest continuous civilization in the entire history of humanity. While the pyramids of Egypt were still tens of thousands of years away from being built, while Rome was not even a distant dream, Aboriginal Australians were already living, navigating, and thriving across this vast continent. Archaeological evidence suggests that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians arrived on the continent somewhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago, making them the oldest known culture still in existence today. 40,000 years ago, these people had already been here for at least 10,000 to 25,000 years. They were not beginners. They were masters. The land they inhabited 40,000 years ago was not the Australia we recognize today. The continent was larger, connected to what is now New Guinea by a land bridge. The climate was different, cooler and wetter in some regions, with massive inland lakes that have long since dried into salt flats. Giant animals roamed the landscape, creatures that modern Australians have never seen outside of a fossil museum. Diprotodon, a wombat-like herbivore the size of a hippopotamus, grazed across the plains. Procoptodon, a kangaroo that stood nearly 10 feet tall, bounded across the grasslands. Megalania, a monitor lizard stretching up to 23 feet in length, was the apex predator before humans arrived. Life in this landscape required intelligence, courage, and an extraordinary ability to read and respond to the natural world at every moment. Survival in prehistoric Australia was not a casual affair. Every single day demanded sharp instincts and deep knowledge. Food was everywhere, but finding it, catching it, and preparing it safely required skills that took years to learn and a lifetime to master. Aboriginal Australians 40,000 years ago were sophisticated hunters and gatherers who understood their environment at a level that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Men hunted with spears tipped with stone points, using a device called a woomera, a spear-throwing tool that effectively extended the length of the arm and dramatically increased the speed and distance of a throw. A woomera-assisted spear could reach velocities comparable to a crossbow bolt. When you factor in that the person throwing it had spent their entire life practicing, hitting a kangaroo from 30 meters away was not an impressive feat. It was an ordinary Tuesday. But hunting large animals was never the only source of food, and in many regions it was not even the primary one. Women, who held enormous knowledge and social power in Aboriginal society, were responsible for gathering a remarkable variety of plant foods, insects, eggs, shellfish, and small animals. They used digging sticks to extract yams and tubers from the earth, with such precision that the plant could regrow the following season. A form of land management that predates any formal concept of agriculture by tens of thousands of years. They knew which berries were edible and which were lethal. They knew how to leach the toxins out of cycad seeds by soaking and baking them, a process requiring exact knowledge and careful timing. Get it wrong and you die. Get it right every single time, generation after generation, and you feed your family. This knowledge was not written down. It lived in the minds, mouths, and hands of the people, passed from mother to daughter, elder to child, across thousands of years without interruption. Water was perhaps the most critical resource on the continent, and Aboriginal Australians had an almost supernatural understanding of where to find it. In a land where rivers vanish underground and rainfall can be absent for years at a time, knowing where the hidden waterholes were was the difference between life and death. This knowledge was embedded in the landscape through a system called the songlines. The songlines, also known as dreaming tracks, were routes across the continent that had been memorized and transmitted through song, dance, and story for thousands of generations. Each songline described a journey made by an ancestral being in the dreamtime, the sacred era of creation at the foundation of Aboriginal cosmology. But the songlines were also intensely practical. They described landmarks, waterholes, food sources, and safe paths through dangerous terrain. Singing the correct songline while walking a particular route was not merely a spiritual act. It was navigation, memory, and survival technology all at once. The concept of the dreamtime is something that many outsiders have reduced to a simple creation myth. But this deeply misrepresents what it actually meant to the people who lived by it 40,000 years ago. The dreamtime was not the past. It was not a story that happened and then ended. It was a living, present reality that existed simultaneously alongside the physical world. A layer of meaning and connection that permeated every rock, every animal, every star, and every human being. The ancestral beings who shaped the land during the dreamtime did not disappear. They became the land. A particular mountain was not just a geological formation. It was the body of an ancestor. A waterhole was not just a pool of water. It was a sacred site where the dreaming was present and active. To live in this world 40,000 years ago was to inhabit a cosmos that was entirely alive and deeply personal, where you were never alone and never separate from the forces that created you. Ceremonies and ritual life were the heartbeat of Aboriginal society, and they were extraordinarily elaborate. Initiation ceremonies for young men were intense, physically demanding, and emotionally transformative experiences that could last for weeks or even months. They involved scarification, the knocking out of teeth, extended periods of isolation in the bush, and instruction in sacred knowledge that could only be shared with those who had proven themselves ready to receive it. These were not casual rites of passage. They were the mechanism by which the entire accumulated knowledge of the culture was transferred from one generation to the next, wrapped in layers of meaning, symbolism, and spiritual authority that made it unforgettable. Women had their own separate ceremonial life, equally complex and equally powerful, much of which remains closed to outsiders even today. Music, art, and storytelling were not entertainment. They were technologies of memory and connection. The didgeridoo, one of the world's oldest wind instruments, was played in ceremonies that could last through the night and into the following day, its deep droning resonance described by players as a sound that connected the human voice to the voice of the earth itself. Rock art painted across the continent told stories, recorded events, and depicted the dreaming beings in extraordinary detail. Some of the rock art sites in the Kimberley region of Western Australia have been dated to at least 40,000 years old, making them among the oldest known artworks in human history. The Wandjina figures, enormous painted faces with large eyes and no mouths, stared down from cliff walls and cave ceilings, representing rain and cloud spirits whose goodwill was essential to the survival of the people. These images were not painted once and left to fade. They were repainted and renewed by each generation, maintaining the living connection between the people and the dreaming. Social structure in Aboriginal Australia was remarkably sophisticated and nothing like the simple tribal organization that outsiders have often assumed. People lived in family groups that were part of larger clans, which were in turn connected to broader networks of related groups across vast territories. Kinship systems were extraordinarily complex, governing everything from marriage to who you could joke with, who you had to show respect to, and who was responsible for performing which ceremonies. These kinship systems divided all of humanity, and indeed all of nature, into categories of relationship, so that every person you met could be immediately placed within a framework that defined exactly how you were connected and what you owed each other. A stranger from hundreds of kilometers away was never truly a stranger. They occupied a defined position in the kinship system, and once that position was established, the obligations and relationships that came with it were immediately clear. Trade networks across the continent were far more extensive than most people realize. Certain types of stone for tool-making, shells from the coast, ochre for ceremony and art, and other valuable materials were traded across networks that spanned thousands of kilometers. Items found at archaeological sites in the interior of Australia have been traced to coastal sources hundreds of miles away, demonstrating that these ancient people were connected across the entire continent in ways that required negotiation, trust, and maintained relationships over generations. Meeting grounds where different groups came together for trade, ceremony, and arranged marriages were critical social institutions that kept the network alive and functioning. Conflict existed in this world, as it does in every human society. Disputes over territory, resources, women, and violations of sacred law could escalate to violence. But Aboriginal society had developed sophisticated mechanisms for managing and resolving conflict that often made full-scale warfare unnecessary. Formal duels between individuals, where both parties had the right to throw spears at each other, could resolve grievances without the broader community being dragged in. Councils of elders had authority to mediate disputes and impose sanctions on those who violated community law. And the sheer necessity of maintaining cooperative relationships across vast distances in a difficult landscape provided powerful incentives to resolve conflicts rather than let them fester. Childbirth and the raising of children in this world was a communal responsibility. Babies were carried close to the body, sleeping with their mothers, and remaining in constant physical contact with family members for the first years of life. Children learned by watching, by participating, and by being gradually introduced to the skills and knowledge they would need as adults. By the time a child was 10 or 12 years old, they could identify hundreds of plant species, track animals across different types of terrain, navigate by stars, and contribute meaningfully to the group's survival. Education was not a separate activity. It was life itself. Death in this world was surrounded by ceremony and spiritual significance that could last for months. The body of the deceased was treated with great care, and the mourning process involved elaborate rituals designed to help the spirit of the dead person return to the dreaming from which it had come. The name of the deceased was often not spoken aloud for a period of mourning, to avoid calling the spirit back before it had completed its journey. Grief was real and deep in this society. The loss of a skilled hunter, a knowledge holder, an elder who carried irreplaceable information in their memory, was not just a personal tragedy. It was a blow to the survival of the entire group. The night sky was a second landscape to Aboriginal Australians, as well understood and as richly mapped as the physical earth beneath their feet. Astronomy was not a hobby or an academic pursuit. It was a survival skill. The positions of stars and constellations indicated the seasons, the availability of particular food sources, and the timing of ceremonies. Aboriginal Australians also identified figures in the dark spaces between the stars, the dark constellations formed by the clouds of the Milky Way, seeing in them the shapes of animals like the emu in the sky, whose rising in autumn corresponded exactly with the season when emu eggs were available on the ground below. This was not coincidence or superstition. It was 40,000 years of careful observation, encoded in myth to make it memorable and transmissible. So what does it add up to? What was it actually like to be an Aboriginal Australian 40,000 years ago? It was a life of extraordinary physical challenge and equally extraordinary intellectual richness. It was a life embedded in deep time, in the knowledge that you were one link in an unbroken chain stretching back further than any other living culture on Earth. It was a life in which the land was not a resource to be used, but a living relative to be respected, in which every star had a story and every stone had a meaning. It was a life in which you were never alone, held in a web of kinship and obligation that connected you to every other human being you would ever meet. It was difficult, dangerous, and sometimes brutal, as all human lives across all of history have been. But it was also profound, purposeful, and sustained by a depth of knowledge and meaning that most modern people will spend their entire lives searching for without ever finding. The Aboriginal Australians of 40,000 years ago were not primitive ancestors waiting for civilization to arrive. They were civilization, the oldest one we know of, and they were right here, on this red, ancient, extraordinary continent, reading the stars and singing the land into existence, long before the rest of the world had any idea this place even existed.